Interrupt Bruce. Honestly, I should just give him his time. But I think we're not going to have enough time with my new friend Dan Rust either. You can turn that down a little, Kevin. I can barely hear myself think. Dan Rust is the author of Workplace Poker. Are you playing the game or just getting played? I think this is such an important book now. And Dan, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you so much, Jordana. I didn't want him to turn on the bumper music either. I love that song.
Me too. Dan, you're a local boy. You from Minneapolis?
I am from Minneapolis. I actually grew up in North Dakota and then moved to Minneapolis. Took a little side trip to San Diego for about 10 years and then eventually made my way back here.
Oh, that's great. And I'm glad that what caused you to write this book? Are you a workplace expert?
Well, I have been developing and delivering workplace training for over 30 years now. And all of the standard stuff, leadership training, customer service, team building, sales, negotiation, all of that stuff. And so I've immersed myself in, I guess, the very tactical nature of helping people develop the skills to be more productive and to grow their careers. But it struck me somewhere 15 years ago or so. One of the things that struck me was that I knew many people who were very skilled, very talented, very committed to what they were doing, but their career trajectories weren't bad, but many of them didn't have the high trajectory careers. And now, again, to be just totally honest, some of the high trajectory careers were driven because someone had the right connections or background or family or money or education. But when you take all those out, you're still left with some people who drive high trajectory careers, and it seems almost disconnected from their level of actual talent and hard work. Not that talent isn't a good thing and hard work is a good thing, but clearly there are some people whose career acceleration goes well beyond their actual level of talent. And I'm not an advocate of saying, hey, talent's not important. Just play the game. Obviously, the best way to approach this is to play both games. The talent and hard work game, as well as this what I call the game under that game.
And you talk about these games in the book, and boy, I really wish I had your book when I was young in my career, because if you don't have a mentor in your office or outside of your office, if you have no mentor, you need a book like this to make you aware of the things that you just don't see sometimes. When you're in the thick of it, you don't necessarily see what's going on around you. And I have to be honest, when you sent me the pitch for the book, you wrote, the worst career advice I ever received was keep your head down, do good work, ignore office politics, and produce results. Just be honest and hardworking, and your career will be fine. And normally, Dan, that would seem like good advice. And you say it's awful.
Well, and I'm a guy who lived that advice. I was a good soldier, and ultimately, where I've come to is I would almost call it a level of suspicion when someone tells me, ignore the politics, just do work. That to me is a red flag for, okay, what's really going on? What's really happening? It's almost like in the Matrix movies where there's there's one world and then there's the other world.
Yes.
And you have to take, do you want the red pill or the blue pill? And in my world, I want to have both pills. And I think what I've come to accept is that this term, office politics, that we all kind of disdain. I mean, truly, it causes most of us to cringe. No one says, I want to play office politics. Of course not. So I've written a book about something that nobody wants to think about. Everyone cringes at. We all find a little distasteful. So I've got that going for me. And basically, though, what I've tried to do in the book is to make it fun, to make it real, very, very real, and also make it positive and ethical, something that almost anybody can go through the stories, and the book is just chock full of real-world stories of sometimes success, not always success. Sometimes we learn the most from other people's failures, and by sharing those stories, my goal really was to have people like myself learn it, but not take 15 years to learn it.
Yes.
And maybe accelerate. Yeah.
That's what I love about it, because if you're just starting your career, I feel like this should be a good graduation gift, because people need to be aware of this. And you talked, at least we started off the conversation, the two games. There's, the talent and hard work game, and everyone needs to play that game, everyone. But then there's the game under the game. And I know it's a little bit about politics, but tell us what you write about in the book and how it is best for us to manage that.
Well, if you accept that human beings, by their nature, are kind of conflicted creatures. We all have this competitive spirit, but we also have this cooperative spirit. When you look at like the study of human beings going, back millennia, there's been more innovation in developing materials for war and weapons of war and destruction than innovation devoted to positive things. So human beings have a very violent history, but we also have a very altruistic history. It's almost like we have these two minds within us, and just because we work in an office where everyone is dressed crisply and professionally and well-groomed, and we smell good, and we smile, and we go through team-building exercises, just because all of that is happening on the surface, the reality is that our basic human nature doesn't go away. And we're not inherently going to be stabbing each other in the back, although that does happen. But you have to accept that there is a certain competitiveness, even with the people who you're really well connected with at work. I mean, the phrase "there's no I in team" is, hey, great on a poster, but there's also no team in promotion. There does come a point where you have to be in this for you as well, to make sure that you're going to get your fair share of recognition, rewards, promotions, etc. And that game under the game, though, the challenge, I think, in helping people learn about it is that, of course, it's different in every business. It's different in every culture. It's different in every environment. And so you have to step back, take some time, and just observe the game in your environment and observe how the game changes when leadership changes, when new players come in, when new people are hired or other people go away. And I have found the best way to do that is to step back emotionally. It's so easy to get frustrated because, yes, there are going to be dumb people at work. There are going to be people who don't do things the way you want them to be done. But I have found the people who are best at this game under the game, they have this ability to step back and observe all of the stuff going on and just not get too caught up in it emotionally. Almost like remember Jane Goodall from 20, 30 years ago?
Of course.
As she was observing chimpanzees, she would observe some horrendous behavior. I mean, killing, beating, raping, eating baby chimpanzees, some horrible things. But she simply dutifully noted those things in her journal without any judgment. It was simply observing. And the same, I think, is true for us in the workplace. Not that we're chimpanzees, but we, as we observe each other, if you can just be a little objective and set your emotions aside, and don't expect that you're going to crack the code in a day, because it doesn't work that way. It's not like you're going to suddenly read people and see what's going on. It's a day in and day out level of observation that doesn't take any more time, doesn't take any more energy. But when you walk into business meetings, once you have sort of these new glasses on, when you walk into a meeting and you simply notice a little bit more, you notice who shares ideas proactively, who's only comfortable echoing the ideas of others, who jokes, who gets along, where do people sit, what's the baseline behavior pattern of all the various people that you work with. And it can drive you crazy if you try to discern all this overnight.
Sure.
So what I tell people is give yourself time. Just relax. Take the time to watch, observe, and just see what you weren't seeing before. And even when someone does something that might frustrate you, just ask yourself good questions like, well, why is that really happening? I mean, why would someone do that? What would motivate someone to do that particular thing? And I think that's when your eyes start to open up regarding what's really going on underneath the surface.
I'm speaking with Dan Rust. He is the author of Workplace Poker. We have much more to discuss. I want to get to accountability, self-promotion, maybe over-promotion, charm in the office, and, of course, mean bosses, bullies, backstabbers, bosses that are dumber than you. I want to accomplish all of it, and I want to get through it with Dan. If you have a question for Dan, he is available to you now, 651-989-9226. If you had a situation at work you want to run by him, now's the time, or you can send me a text to 81807. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be back with Dan Rust in just a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking with Dan Rust, the author of Workplace Poker. And this is a book that is literally like a how-to manual on how to help manage your career and see some blind spots in yourself that you might have not seen before, how to manage mean bosses. And I really want to get to the part about accountability, Dan, because I feel like accountability gets lost a little in certain workplaces. You call it taking the hit in Chapter 3. Why is this so important?
Well, I think for virtually all of us in the modern work environment, it's always easy to find other people who are contributors to whatever your failings might be. Because everything that we do is dependent upon other people. You have a producer, you have other people who you depend on. So if something doesn't go quite right, if you have a leaning toward blaming others or leaning toward shifting the blame, it's real easy, and it's probably somewhat accurate. So we all depend upon other people, and so what I've seen in the modern work environment is, while we all talk about personal accountability, for the most part, when it comes to the tough stuff, when there's an actual failure, even when someone has a career downward spiral where maybe they get laid off or they get fired or something else bad happens to them, there's just this knee-jerk instant reaction of blaming others, blaming the boss, blaming the business, blaming leadership, blaming coworkers who threw you under the bus, blaming whatever. And I'm not saying that isn't sometimes true. In fact, maybe often it's somewhat true. It just doesn't help. And so the process that I walk people through in the chapter on accountability really lays out a mindset of almost going overboard in terms of accepting personal accountability for the bad things that have happened in your life, because I don't think we learn otherwise. We just end up kind of stewing in the juices of the bad stuff. But when you accept the fact that if you had a tough boss who was unfair and maybe threw you under the bus, ultimately you put yourself in that situation. You accepted that job, or at some point you recognized that the boss was what he was or she was. And we walk people through a process for really seeing that ultimately they created the environment that they're in. They created the environment where these things happen. And then once you do that, the question is, what can you learn from it? Not simply, well, I'm never going to work for a jerk again. Oftentimes there's real deep learning that can help you and help advance your career, but you never get to that deep learning if you are in sort of that 50-50 mindset even. If you say, well, yeah, part of it was me, part of it was them. Whenever we say that, what we really mean is it's mostly them, and we probably don't do the deep thinking that we need to figure out, okay, what can I learn from this, and how can I prevent it from going forward? And this, I'll be honest, this is probably the toughest concept in the book. I've had so many people say, well, yeah, but this, and this happened to me,
right,
and that's not fair, and that person was unethical or did something illegal, and I totally get it. And at the same time, if all you focus on is the fact that someone did something illegal to you, well, you're not going to really learn much from this. So ask yourself, how did you put yourself in that situation? What was it that drew you to it, and what was it that kept, or why didn't you discern it sooner? How did you end up being in a situation where you feel like you were suddenly thrown under the bus? If you ask the right questions, ultimately you always come to a point where you say, yeah, all right, I probably could have been more of something or less of something, and how can I learn to do that in my next situation?
That is life-changing. I mean, I really mean that, because I hear a lot of, I can think of situations, of friends that I've had that, they get hired and then that boss leaves and they end up with like a horrible boss from hell. How is that possibly their fault? But I guess if they really think about it, it's, that they stayed, or that they, didn't make an effort to get along with that second person. Or I guess there's always accountability in every situation.
And they will spend years telling anyone who will listen about that horrible boss from hell.
Oh, yeah.
And then the boss gets worse as time progresses, and the story gets better, and they get more sympathy. But in the end, all they are left with is a story. And then they're going to be determined, I'm never going to work for anyone like that again.
Yep.
Well, that's such shallow thinking that, in fact, sometimes when you really peel the layers away and you start to think about it deeply, I know for me personally, some of my worst bosses have been some of the best learning experiences.
Yes.
Not all. Some of them were just
Yes.
bad. But
No, that's
some
true.
of them were great.
Yes. Yes. Okay. David, I got some texts coming in for us, but gosh, I knew an hour wasn't going to be enough for us. I might have to bring you back. Let's see. David, Dan, I'm applying for a new job. How can I tell if the atmosphere is going to be a right fit for me? I've heard some people say that my new boss is terrible. How can I discern this? He asked a weird question in the interview saying, "What have you heard from others about me?" Ooh, wow, red flag. Interesting.
Well, yeah, and now let me give you this caveat before I answer the question. Based on a limited understanding of the situation, I'm going to share a few initial thoughts, but I always worry because sometimes it's like giving a shotgun to a 6-year-old. You're going to say, well, here are 3 things to try, and depending upon how they're done, things can go well or not so well. But what I found is if you're trying to figure out whether someone is maybe a bit of a jerk or a bit unreasonable, or you're just trying to kind of crack their code, I would ask a few questions that just go a little beyond the normal polite questions that we would ask. Like if that person asked the question of me, what have you heard about me? I would find a somewhat respectful way to say, well, I have to be frank with you. I've heard some good things and I've heard some not so good things. For example, I've heard, ABC, whatever it might be, and you would want to communicate in a manner, but then watch the reaction. And, if someone hears the hard truth and that causes them to dial up and get a little, frustrated, you get a sense of, okay, this is the kind of person ultimately I'm going to be working with. Now, for me personally, and again, this one is definitely personal, I like to tell a few jokes and see whether they get me and whether they get my humor. Because I know that if they don't, it's just not going to, work out well long term. Because I have kind of an edgy, borderline inappropriate sense of humor sometimes. But for me, that's what works. It keeps me engaged in the workplace. So I think by bringing yourself to the interview, I'm truly sharing with who you are, and maybe even asking a couple of tough questions. Sure. It will tell you, okay, is this a guy who can play at that level, or is this someone who gets frustrated by that? And then I would just say, if your gut is telling you, is making you feel a little queasy, you have to ask yourself a question, which is there anything unique about this situation where it would be worth it to step into the fire? Because sometimes it is. Sometimes you get that queasy feeling and you say, oh, I don't think this is going to be a fun person to work with. But it's a foothold in a particular company, or I get exposure to particular people, or there's some other reason for doing it. And then at least you don't drive yourself crazy. You say, all right, I am stepping into the fire, and I know it, and I'm doing it for these reasons, and I don't expect that it's all going to be sweetness and sunshine.
Yeah, and awareness of it, knowing what you're getting into, that's half the battle right there.
Without
Dan, we have to take another break, okay? I'm speaking with Dan Rust. He's written Workplace Poker. He's actually local, and he's giving us free and awesome advice, Dan. I really appreciate you sticking with us. We have another text lined up about Donald Trump as a boss. But when we get back, I want to talk about charm. I believe I read that, Dan, if you could pick a trait to be naturally born with, it would be charm. I think I'm attributing that to you. I think I read that in your research. Okay. I want to know why and what kind of role charisma plays in the workplace. You might be surprised by Dan's answer. Dan Rust and I will return after the. Welcome back. Jordana Green here. Thanks for hanging out with me tonight. We're talking about workplace politics, workplace bullies, workplace charm, how to get ahead and not get your career derailed. I'm talking with Dan Rust. Dan is the author of Workplace Poker. Are you playing the game or just getting played? And none of us want to think that we're getting played. We want to think we're in control. Dan writes in his book, Workplace Poker, we often have blind spots where we don't know what we don't know. We have to identify those. And honestly, the book is like a manual. He tells great stories, cringeworthy sometimes, of people falling into these traps. Right, Dan? I mean, some of them are, bad. But they're good, but they're bad. You'll be grateful they didn't happen to you. And the book is a great graduation gift, because if you have someone just starting out in their career, hopefully they would be available to listen to this information, because it's all of the lessons you wish you knew at the beginning of your career.
Now, let me just say, the only danger in that, because I've had some interesting responses from people in the kind of the very early stages of their career, like just getting into the career world, where they've read through maybe the first 3 or 4 chapters, and there's a bit of a shock to the system, like, oh my God, this is what happens, and I have to kind of talk them down a bit to say, look, the book is a compression of many, many, many stories. So it's not like you're going to walk into the work world and suddenly everything is going to be intensely political, like you're in the mafia. Although it can happen, but it's not going to be that bad. Where I've gotten, I think, the most positive responses from people who've been actually in the work world for maybe at least 5 or 10 years, and they've experienced at least some of it, and now it's almost like you're peeling the layer away to say, here's what you can do about these things that you've really been experiencing. I totally agree that it's a great gift for someone just going into the work world, but give them a couple of hugs at the same time.
You don't want to scare the crap out of them.
Right.
I get it. I totally get it. I did want to talk about charm, because we think, okay, charm has no place in the workplace. You need to work. You need to produce. You need to, you need to play nice, with people. But come on, charm, what does charisma have to do with getting ahead?
Well, and, I have to be honest, I was a very charm-challenged person in my early years, overly serious. My background is in engineering, so I was all about data, and I was all about process and getting projects done on time and on budget. And it took me personally a long time and some serious coaching from other people to just accept that there is a real value in developing charm. And now I'm a good student, so once the switch was flipped, I decided I really was going to try to be more gracious and charming. And really what I mean by charm is when you think about the people in your life who just have that natural positive grace about them. They're very confident, they're very kind. They're also very wise. It's not that they don't see the faults in other people. Mm-hmm. It's that they see the whole person and make a decision to focus on typically the more positive things, unless there's a reason to focus on some of the more challenging things. And I think one of the best examples I've been a part of in helping someone go from charm challenged to actually having that grace and that ability to move people with the power of your positive spirit, not to get too woo-woo about it, but even though I'm basically a North Dakota and Minnesota boy, I've managed to sell myself as a corporate trainer in some really interesting environments. And I spent some time in Saudi Arabia doing some leadership development for Saudi Aramco, and met a woman who was part of the workshop. She was an engineering supervisor, great lady, incredibly competent. The people who she worked with, who were mostly men, had expressed great respect for her competency, but she was incredibly abrasive to work with. And in fact, there were men who had altered their career path. They decided, I'm not going to work in this department, I'm going to work somewhere else. And essentially, she had the reputation of, yeah, she's really good, just don't cross her or don't disagree with her. And so, because that was the feedback I'd been given from senior leadership, they'd said to me, one of the things we'd like you to do, not as a formal part of the program, because that will make her mad. So I had like a secret training objective as we went through a week-long leadership development program. So I made sure that I had lunch with her the first day, and when we had dinner in the evening, I made sure I sat with her, and I had a chance to spend time with her early on. And by the time we were about halfway through, I felt like I had enough rapport where when we broke out into one-on-one conversations and each individual in the program had a coach, I assigned myself as her coach. And so I began to ask her questions about her attitude toward the people that she worked with. And the reason it's a great example is because she had very good reasons for being abrasive. She walked me through how she had been wronged from the get-go. As a young worker at Saudi Aramco, her career was limited because she was a woman, so she had limitations in terms of what she could do, where she could go, how she'd been treated. But it was almost as if she was like emotional Velcro. She had grabbed onto every one of those experiences, and she was so determined no one was going to screw her ever again. It's almost like, I'm going to get you first before you. And basically, it took a while for her to acknowledge what had happened is her feelings got hurt. I mean, to make a long story short, luckily, I actually got to go back 2 times and spent a fair amount of time with her individually the second time I was there. And we really dug into this because I came to a realization that this was the one thing holding her back. Everyone respected her. Everyone knew that she did great work. And, in fact, not only did everyone respect her, but the work environment had actually shifted over the course of her career because she'd been working for Saudi Aramco for over 20 years. So imagine 20 years ago what it was like. And while it's still very stifling today, it's nothing like what it was 20 years ago. But she was carrying all that baggage. And so with a fair amount of just honest discussions, and we came to a point where she agreed this was an area that she really had to work on. And she and I, we've stayed in contact over the last couple of years, and it's been amazing to hear the stories from her. Now, it's very difficult for her. To go from abrasive to charming is a pretty big leap, but it's actually working where she's realizing that she can get far more done with a genuine, pleasant demeanor that embraces, other people's opinions and doesn't immediately assume because you disagree with me that means you disrespect me. So I know for an absolute fact that most of us can be more charming if we put a little effort into it, and we maybe have good models in our either personal or work lives for what real charm can be.
That is definitely a great story. We only have about a minute or so left, but what is your advice? Because I hear people say all the time, there are people that are holding them back. And I know we spoke about what is our accountability, what is our role in somebody you feel like is holding you back. But what if you really have a boss that you can't get out from under their thumb? What do you do about someone who's toxic in the workplace?
You step back and make a quick objective, a quick assessment of what are you getting from this situation. And while there are definitely circumstances where it makes sense to work for a Donald Trump or an Anna Wintour or other people like that, if you're working in that kind of environment that I call a cult of personality, where ultimately everything is about that person, it's not bad. It just is what it is. And you have to decide, am I getting enough out of this to work in that environment? And if you're not, then really the only answer is to plan your exit strategy, because that is not going to change. It is just, and in fact, people drive themselves nuts thinking that if I'm only good enough, that person will change, or if I only work harder, that person, no, or somehow they'll eventually go away. They stay around much longer than you want them to or expect them to, and ultimately, if the organization is being driven by that cult of personality, again, I don't want to sound like I'm judging it, although I am obviously a little bit, but I think you're better off if you don't judge it. I mean, like or hate Donald Trump, if I was working for him, I would be wisest to set aside any frustration I have that it's all about him, and accept that that's what it is, and then ask myself, what am I getting? And if I'm not getting enough, it's time to move on.
That's great advice. And the book is full of it. We didn't even get to self-promotion or over-promotion. Dan Rust, it's called Workplace Poker. Are you playing the game or just getting played? Dan, where can we find the book?
Any place books are sold. You can go to workplacepoker.com, but it's available everywhere, all bookstores and Amazon, everywhere else that books are sold.
What are you working on now?
Well, I had a radio interview a couple of days ago, and there was the interviewer had a turn of phrase. He said something like, all managers suck. And that grabbed my attention. I thought, I don't know that it's necessarily absolutely true.
I don't think it's true.
But there are a lot of them that do. So I'm actually working on a book that's related to how specifically do you take a manager who's, let's say, less than ideal, and create an ideal situation with a less than perfect manager. But for the most part, I'm just enjoying talking to people about the content of this book, because it seems to have struck a chord that more than even I expected.
I would agree. Dan, it has been my pleasure to talk to you, and I have a feeling I'm going to be calling on you in the future to come back on the show.
Totally mutual. Thank you so much, Jordana.
Thank you, Dan. Have a great night.
Good night.
Boy, I learned a lot. It's a terrific book. I have it in the house. It's a great one. All right, let's take a break. We'll be back in just a moment. Or so left with you, but boy, I love that segment. I thought he had some terrific information, and I feel like we don't often ask for, career advice. We don't. We just kind of plod along, and we are grateful to have jobs, because God knows the recession was hard on everybody, so I understand that. But, there are probably better ways to manage it and things we can even learn along the way in our career. So great conversation with Dan Rust. Thank you, Dan, again, for coming on. Coming up tomorrow, Stephen Blair Venable is going to join me. He and I skipped our segment last week because of the Prince situation. So that he is back tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit about Prince. He'll share a story or two. And we'll also finish his segment on the best advice or the worst advice we were ever given, and what we should take or shouldn't take. And Stephen says, like Dan's segment, he wishes he knew the things and the advice at the beginning of his career, at the beginning of his life, so he didn't have to learn stuff the hard way. And that's just life, right? Learning a lot of it the hard way. But hopefully we will learn something from him, so we will not necessarily have to go through it on our own. I'm about out of time. Kevin Reed, thanks for sticking with me in the studio, and I'll be back with you tomorrow night. Al Malmberg is next.